I did also find out, and I don't know if this is true for Singapore, tipping is an insult.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the world. I remember traveling in Europe with my mom and grandmother before she passed. We went on this nice little European trip. And yeah, they told us straight up, you guys aren't really supposed to tip.
Hmm.
Just because they got used to American tourists doing that, some of them don't mind it. But yeah, there were times where people will look at you and like, really? You're going to give me extra money? You think less of me in that way? They do get insulted.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you don't think I make enough.
Yeah, I mean, that's the main thing is every other part of the world. It's not so much that people don't make enough money, so they rely on their tips. But in America, that's absolutely the case. Because, Lisa, I don't know if I mentioned, but I work as a server as kind of my filler job
Hmm.
when I'm not doing visual effects stuff.
Yeah.
And there was a question on Quora asking if you should tip somebody, how much you should tip, what happens if you don't tip them, what happens if you tip them on a credit card as opposed to cash, why would you do that?
Yeah.
So, of course, I went down a rabbit hole
Yeah.
because that's just the way my mind works. With servers, you are paid at a different minimum wage level because you are completely reliant on your tips,
Yeah.
as opposed to a hairstylist where it's like, well, we know you're getting tipped, but we don't know how much because different people tip different amounts
Hmm.
and some people don't tip at all. So, assuming that if you're not reporting at least 15% tips, that you are very likely just not reporting your tips. And if you're not reporting your tips, then they're going to come after you because that is taxable income.
Which is why bartering is illegal.
Right. Yeah, it's all about taxable income. Thing I found really interesting with servers is I went through government data on the bottom 10%, top 90%, and the median hourly pay for servers since 2002. And assuming servers typically make federal minimum wage, which is most of the case, there's a number of states where they do have minimum wage for that state at the actual minimum wage as opposed to server minimum wage, which is notably lower.
Yeah.
Real minimum wage is $7.50. Server minimum wage is $2.13 an hour. And that has pretty much not budged since before 2002 because they didn't have data for 2023 yet. So I was like, okay, we'll do 2022 to 2002 and just figure out how much wage growth is happening in relation to overall cost of living increases and whatnot, which in general, servers are actually starting to get to a point where we're not being hit quite as hard by inflation because our pay is directly related to the cost of a meal. So if the cost of a meal goes up, then our pay goes up.
Right, because percentages will rise.
Yeah, exactly. So median level servers have been beating inflation by a small percentage year over year.
Okay.
Not a drastic amount, but the bottom 10% have been not even matching inflation year over year. So the bottom 10% are getting hit significantly harder every year. And the top 10%, aside from 2015 and 2022, every other year they've been fluctuating up and down. It really is just those middle level servers that are doing slightly better than they did before.
I would be curious to what the numbers are in San Francisco because
Mm-hmm.
they were one of the first to raise minimum wage and do all that. And I would be curious historically
Mm-hmm.
what changes they saw and who was positively and negatively affected by those changes.
Oh, absolutely. I'm curious about that too. I mean, most of the West Coast does that at this point. I think Oregon, Washington, and California all have minimum wage at notably above federal minimum wage, and they don't have a different minimum wage depending on whether or not you're a server. Could be wrong on Oregon and Washington, but I'm pretty sure. I know California is that way. And I know that Texas specifically is not that way. Texas does have server minimum wage basically right at federal minimum wage. But yeah, so the data point that I found really interesting is that server pay, their base pay, that 215 an hour or 213 an hour, whatever it is, back in 2002, for most servers would make up about 30% of all the money they made. And so as long as they were being taxed by their employer throughout the year, they would get money back every single year because the tax rate of a server in that range was generally 12%. So if you're being taxed on your overall pay, and almost every server experienced where you just get a $0 paycheck because they're taking out taxes, assuming that you owe taxes even when you don't. So at the end of the year, you'd get a few $1,000 back. But now your base pay is only making up 15%. So if they don't take every single penny of the hourly wages that you make, then you're probably going to owe in the end. So servers went from expecting $2,000 or more back at the end of the year to now owing $500+ at the end of the year.
Yeah.
It's just really interesting how that shift has happened. And for like the top 90%, it's even more drastic because it went from about 20% of their base pay to 8% of their base pay. So it's less than half.
Are you 1099? Can you itemize anything?
No, not as a server. Servers are all W-2s
Okay.
because they're not considered independent contractors, although they effectively act as that.
Yeah.
Because the vast majority of restaurants nowadays do what's called a tip out. It's not exactly tip sharing, but it's a tip out where servers will pay their bartenders, their expos, their bussers, their food runners.
Oh.
Basically, server assistants, expos, and bartenders are generally the ones that are being tipped out. Occasionally, they'll add in like the host, and sometimes they even add in the kitchen staff. But that is going to be based off of their sales, not off of their tips. So that was kind of what I was getting into with that Quora question, where somebody was like, well, what if I stiff them? I was like, well, if you stiff them, and let's just say you were there for an hour and it took them a half hour to set up, a half hour to tear down, and your bill came out to $100, they have to pay the other people they work with about $5 to $6, and they're making less than $5 or $6 in hourly wages off of working for 2 hours. So they literally are going to be more poor going home from work than if they just didn't go to work at all.
Yeah.
If you stiff them, they are literally paying for the privilege of working for you if you stiff a server. So for anybody that's listening, if we use this in in any of our podcasts, please tip your servers. The other thing I kind of went over was why people tip in cash as opposed to on a credit card.
Yeah.
And that basically comes down to giving the server the ability to not report those tips if they choose to. And also on top of that,
Yeah, we always tip in cash if we can.
well, and on top of that, you're actually helping the restaurant itself by tipping in cash because restaurants have to pay a percentage of any transaction that happens through a credit card,
Yes.
which is typically 2 to 3% depending on the credit card. Some can even be higher, like American Express tends to be notably higher.
Which is why a lot of places won't take it.
Yeah, exactly. And same with Discover. But MasterCard and Visa tend to be on the lower end, which is why they're accepted in more places because people don't have to pay for the privilege of having people pay with a card instead of cash.
And all of these reasons is literally, we used to have friends who would stiff us if we all went out, and we would end up covering the tip because we're not going to be those people.
Mm-hmm.
We would cover the tip so that the waiter would get something, and they would go, well, we can't afford to tip. And we would just say, well, then you can't afford to go out and eat.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Or you can't afford to order what you ordered.
Right.
Because everyone is aware that there is a social contract, not a legal contract, but a social contract that servers are expecting between a 15 and 22% tip. Nowadays, it's between an 18 and 22% tip, realistically.
I always do 20, unless there's alcohol involved.
Fair.
Well, alcohol, I tip more.
Right. That typically tends to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
With that social construct, you have to anticipate that expense being added to the end of your bill.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're looking at what you want to order off the menu, you're looking at how much it costs and deciding, can I afford that?
Yeah.
Well, you need to be considering, can I afford that plus 20% more of whatever it costs? Because that's actually the cost. Like that's what it's going to cost when I walk out the door. That plus 20% plus tax.
Right.
So if you can't do that calculation ahead of time, if you don't know if you can afford that ahead of time, then don't go out and eat. Like,
Yeah.
if you can't afford to, you are literally stealing money from the working poor if you do that, because the vast majority of servers are under the poverty level too, because servers typically work 30 to 35-hour weeks because they literally can't work more. I mean, a meal is not a full 8-hour shift. So you would have to work a double, and working a double means you're working from about 10 a.m. until about midnight.
Uh,
So, I mean, if you work somewhere where there's a lot of setup and a lot of tear down, like where I work right now, I work at a fine dining restaurant.
yeah.
We get there about 2 hours before our first guest sits down, and we can be there for up to 2 hours after they leave, just because there's so much preparation that goes into it and making sure that everything is set up perfectly before they walk in the door.
Now, have you considered being like something involved with serving alcohol?
Like a bartender?
Yes, or working at a place that does serve alcohol. The only reason I ask that is that tends to yield a higher tipping ratio.
Typically, yes. The fine dining restaurant I work at does serve alcohol. They have really interesting, like, speakeasy style cocktail list and really nice wines that are also not super expensive, unique beers. They do a really good job with their alcohol selection, and we do serve it to tables more often than not because it is a fine dining establishment. So it's not a lot of sodas and sweet teas. It's more alcoholic drinks in general. But yeah, I've considered being a bartender. I think I think at least right now it fits my skill set a little bit better as a server. I actually really enjoy being a server.
Oh, cool.
It's fun because you get to give people a really nice experience when they go out to enjoy themselves. And I know that a lot of people can't afford to go out to eat very often, if at all.
Yeah.
So particularly being in that fine dining restaurant and having people come in for their anniversaries or birthdays or like before prom when kids come in, like they're hoping for something really nice. And being able to provide that for them, like that just puts a smile on my face because they get to enjoy themselves a lot too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just thought it was really interesting that server-based pay, it went from being in like the 60 to 80% range to now being in the 75 to 92% range. Like that really does highlight that restaurants are not paying their servers enough in general. And it really, really highlights how not increasing minimum wage translates to kind of the industry making up for it, but in a way that hurts consumers in general, as opposed to making sure that businesses are held accountable for taking care of their employees.
Yeah. Good to know. I didn't know about the paying the cooks and I didn't know about all that.
Oh yeah, I mean at the place I work at, it's 5% tip out. So if we make 15% for tips across the board, we walk home with 10%.
Wow.
Yeah, because it's 5% of sales. It's not 5% of what we make in our tips. So when we get tipped generally 20%, we actually walk home with generally 15%.
So the government will charge you then, assuming you make 15%.
Correct.
Could you fight that?
Because of the way the restaurant reports it, the amount that we tip out is not considered taxable because it effectively never entered our pocket.
Okay.
So we're not taxed on 20% if we only walk home with 15.
Okay. This is not fair.
Right. Real quick. So the other thing I was talking about, the reason why people tip with cash instead of card is because when you tip on a card, the restaurant has to pay a certain percentage based off of the transaction amount. So if you tip, say, 20% on a card, that is 20% of all the money that you're spending. That is now an added expense for the restaurant. So actually, well, no, I'm not going to pull it up, but I ran some quick numbers. Is like, okay, if your bill's $100 and you tip $20 and you do the tip on a card as opposed to cash, It effectively comes down to most restaurants are going to be paying around $3,000 every year minimum just for the people that tip on credit cards.
Wow.
Yeah, $3,000 just from that little like 3 to 5% that credit card companies charge for that transaction amount.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I never thought of it that way. Wow.
Yeah.
The card.
Right. I mean, I still do it too. There's going to be times when you don't have the correct amount of cash to be able to tip accurately,
Real.
and you don't want to go under at all. You don't want to go way over. So there has to be a balance there. And sometimes that just means tipping on a card, which it does hurt the restaurant a little bit. And it does make it so that the server has to report those tips. But it is what it is.
But it really is, because if you back up the money, how much money would you say we tip in a year?
Well, that all depends on how often people go out to eat. I mean, there's people that go out to eat maybe once a year, and
You tip the valet, you tip the car wash, you tip the hairdresser, you tip all these different people,
Mhm.
but you don't get to write off your tips.
Right.
That's interesting, the dynamic of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because it's effectively you paying wages to someone else, which the company does get to write off, but you don't get to write it off. But you
Right.
are paying. So, in other words, it's hitting your pocket twice as hard because
Yeah.
the company doesn't want to pay their employees a legitimate wage, even a legitimate wage in context to the portion of which they were paying 20 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
which is not that long ago. Like 2002 is not a crazy amount of time ago.
No, it's not. And it's also one of the reasons why, because I do donations. Well, I do child fund. I have 2 kids that we're putting through school in different countries. And I have my St. Jude donations, because 100% of those donations go to the hospital to treat these kids.
Mhm.
So I do a lot of kid-based donations.
Mhm.
But I do them directly,
That's good.
because when I do them directly, I can get the tax write-off.
Mhm.
If you do it through, say you go to the grocery store, oh, do you want to round up to donate to so-and-so? No,
Mhm.
no, because that's your company that's going to get the tax write-off.
Exactly. And that's the main reason why they did that.
I know.
That's why all these companies are like, hey, do you want to round up to donate to this group? They're not doing it to help out that group. That's a residual impact. The main reason they're doing it is for the tax write off,
Exactly.
so that they don't actually have to invest in their company to not pay as much in taxes. They let their customers pay their taxes for them, and then they pocket the profit.
Yep. I'm like, no, I already make my donations through my own channels. Thank you very much.
Yeah. But saying, no, I'm not going to give to a charity feels like you're being a bad person.
Oh my God, right?
Yeah, it's a guilt trip. It's social programming to make people feel like they have to help out the needy.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to pay a billionaire to help out the needy. I can just help them out directly.
Exactly. Smart people unite.
Exactly.